Hello everyone, Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club here, continuing our series in the endgame with kings and pawns. And in previous videos, I hope you've seen that through tools like opposition or the rectangular method, or what I called the king's square, others call entering the square of the pawn, that the end result could be a win for the side that has the single pawn, or it could even end up in a draw, especially if that single pawn is a rook pawn. So today we're going to look at what if the side with the advantage has two pawns instead of one. And so we're going to look at some different positions. We're going to look at doubled pawns, we're going to look at connected pawns, and then also split pawns. So let's get started. Here on the screen we have doubled pawns. If you don't know, doubled pawns are when the pawns are stacked one in front of the other. What that means is that this backward pawn here can't move forward because there's a pawn in his way. And so backward pawns are considered a weakness. And here we're going to see how it would be a draw, except having this extra pawn is going to give white a much needed tempo to convert from a draw to a win. Now, if you haven't seen our other two videos on opposition or distant opposition in the rectangular method, I heavily encourage you to go ahead and watch those first and then come back here because we're going to see opposition happening right now. So if it's black's turn to move, he can force a draw here. Because what's white to do? White's king needs to stay next to his pawns or he's going to lose them. If black gobbles up these pawns, then it's a draw. So white has to stay next to his pawn. Black's able to get one. And we're going to see here through the concept of black seizing the opposition and staying in front of the pawn. Black seizes the opposition, stays in front of the pawn. That as this marches down the board, white's king can't make progress. Doesn't matter what side he goes to. Hopefully you've seen this before and you recognize this position as a draw. We can see that black cannot move here or here due to the pawn. White's king covers those squares. Black's king, of course, is not in check. This is a stalemate. Okay. So in this position here, if white tried to move behind the pawns, it still doesn't matter. We still end up with black seizing the opposition, and it continues on down the board. Okay. However, in this position, if it were white's turn to move, and white was able to move forward to keep black's king away from the pawn, then even though black is seizing the opposition, and pretend for a moment that this pawn doesn't exist, if you've studied opposition, you know this is a draw. However, as the process for the draw continues like we just saw previously with just the single pawn, and we march down the board and black's trying to get the draw. The problem for black is, in this position, if it were white's turn to move, he would be forced to move here, causing that draw that we just saw. However, he has this extra pawn. All he has to do is move the pawn. Now it's black's turn to move. And now let's take a look at it. While the pawn is covering here and here, and the king is covering here and here, black's king does have a space to move to. At which point, white claims the queening square, covering where the pawn is going to promote to. Doesn't matter where black moves, and the queen is coming. And then there's checkmate, because this pawn is covering the runaway square. Okay, so that shows you that with doubled pawns, it really kind of determines win or draw if the defending king can gobble up one of those pawns or not and create that drawn position. But with that extra pawn, he can get the tempo he needs. Now, this position, still those doubled pawns, if we go back previously one position, and let's show you what that looked like. You'll notice we moved one pawn down the board, and we left this pawn behind simply to be utilized as a gain of tempo. But oftentimes people are thinking, well, what if I march both pawns together? And eventually they get to a position similar to this one. And you don't want to march both pawns together. You want to leave the one far behind, because you can accidentally blunder into a draw. So if white checks and the king steps in front, Well, here again, we remember that if this pawn didn't exist and white's king was forced to move here, we would have a draw. So, like the previous example, we simply move the pawn to gain a tempo. Again, black's only square is here because these squares are all covered by the king and the pawn. So when the king moves, here's the problem. Here is the danger, is that this pawn is attacking that square. So if white tries to seize the queening square, thinking he's going to make a queen, the problem is he just caused a stalemate. Let's take a look at the board. Defended by a pawn, defended by the other pawn, defended by white's king. This is a stalemate. Black has nowhere to go. So by bringing this pawn into the action early on, it caused an accidental stalemate. So if that pawn is there, what are we to do here? Well, simply move this pawn and create a queen. Black's forced to take it. White seizes the opposition with the remaining pawn, and now it doesn't matter if black goes to the left or black goes to the right. Does not matter. White can claim the queening square, and that queen is coming. Okay, so hopefully you understand that if we start in this position here, leave this pawn behind, play like you're going for a draw until the key moment, then use this pawn as a tempo gain, win the game. Okay, so what if the king is completely out of play and it's just the black king or the defending king against connected pawns instead of doubled pawns? Connected pawns being side by side can help defend one another. As you can see, this pawn is defending his friend. So black wants to get next to both pawns to prevent them from moving. If this pawn moves forward, then black's king is just simply going to gobble it up, and then this one is soon going to fall off the board. So white's not going to move those pawns. White moves his king. Now what's black to do? The mistake would be if black took this pawn, because then this pawn's moving and running away. And in one of the previous videos, we talked about what I called the king's square. Other people call it entering the square of the pawn. And the idea is pretty simple. Let's just look at that. If he takes and he moves, you can take a look at the pawn. You draw a line to where he's queening to. You draw a line diagonally to the edge of the board and complete that square. If black's king is, or the defending king is ever inside this square in any of these squares, he can stop the pawn from promoting. If he's outside the square, he's too slow. So black can try, but he's never going to catch this pawn. The queen is coming. So this is why it's so important that black has to stay in front of these pawns. He cannot take this pawn. So black has to stay in front. And from there, white can take his time. Because since black can never capture this pawn, and he can obviously never capture this one because he's protected by the backward pawn, then white can take his time coming over, and black has to stay in front. Eventually, white's going to seize the opposition. And what's black to do here? He doesn't really have too many places he can go. Check it out. Covered by the king, covered by the pawn. He can go to either one of these back squares, and once that happens, that queen is coming. So if the pawns are connected, there's nothing black can do. This is going to be a win for white. So that's something you want to recognize as you're making trades and discovering what pawns are going to be left behind. At least with doubled pawns, you had a chance for a draw. Connected pawns, there's just no chance. It's going to be a win. Okay. Now, let's take a look at split pawns. We're going to look at 3 different versions of split pawns. This one, they're separated by one file. These pawns are, as you can see, they've got one empty file in between them. We'll look at another one where this pawn is over here with 2 empty squares in between, and we'll look at another one where the pawn is over there with 3 squares in between, and how that changes the dynamics of everything. With split pawns, you just have to be aware of a blunder. Other than that, they should be able to defend one another. We'll give black the move so he has his best chances. and all he wants to do is step in front of a pawn, hoping to capture one and then go capture the other. What you can notice is as soon as the other pawn moves, look at what's happening. This pawn is covering that square, and this pawn is covering that square. The king can't make any progress. And just like the previous example, if black captures this pawn, this one's off to the races. The king is outside the square of the pawn. He's not going to catch it. So black has to try and stay in front. This gives white an opportunity to move the king into position because, again, notice these pawns are keeping the king away. Black's king tries to stay in front. White moves the pawn, and you'll notice if we go back to the very beginning of this exercise, that's the exact same setup with the two pawns being side by side and the king in the middle in front. But after a few moves, they've moved their way down the board. They're now on the 5th rank instead of the 4th rank, so they've made progress. So again, white can try maybe the other pawn, push the pawn. Again, notice the king can't make any progress. If he captures, this one's off to the races, so he cannot capture. This again gives an opportunity for the king to move into position. Black tries to stay in front. We move the pawn, and there we are again, similar, but now instead of starting on the 4th rank to the 5th rank, we're now in the 6th rank. Again, we're making progress. Try to stay in front. And what's black to do here? If black captures the pawn, we're going to have a queen. So black obviously cannot capture here, where that queen is coming. And where can he go? These squares are cut off. He's never going to catch this pawn. It's game over. All right, so let's look at some other alternatives here. Black can move in. Well, what if black moved here? Well, same idea. And where's black going to go? If he captures the pawn, this rook pawn is queening. And if he steps back here, there's just no way of catching up. All right, so let's look at some other options. There was an opportunity for a blunder. Let's go find it. So in this position here, when we brought this pawn up and you saw how that was the position we were looking for, what if white thought, well, I just need to get my king over there to help. And he made the mistake of moving his king. Well, now black can move into position. And let's just take a look at what happens here. He can capture the pawn now. And both pawns are gone for a draw. So you have to allow the white pawns to protect one another in this position. The correct move is keeping these pawns helping each other out. If instead white got greedy with the king, you can see that pawn's going to fall, which leads to the next pawn falling. Okay, so then what if white continues to just try to get his king in position? Again, we can capture it. And there's nothing that white's king can do because he's away, and this, again, is a stalemate. Both have been taken. So let's move on real quickly here to what if they are 2 squares apart? So in this position, again, we can attack a pawn. The pawn moves, and you've got to be careful here because now these pawns don't protect one another. See, black has a square he can move to. So as the king tries to come in, black can enter that square, and he can capture that pawn. And the problem is that now he's left with a rook pawn. And if you saw on our recordings about opposition, rook pawns are often a draw because the king gets stuck in the corner. And there's all kinds of different moves that can be made here with that rook pawn. And what we learned in the other video was if black is trying to get his king into the corner, if black can ever get his king into any of these 7 squares, it's going to be a draw. So you definitely want to watch that video. For instance, as it's moving down here, what if white's king tried to step out? Well, then black's just going to go ahead and stick himself in the corner, and then that's a draw. So go ahead and check out that video for more information on that one. But I hope that you can see here that the big difference here is that these pawns are not cutting off the king. The king has a square he can go to. So there's opportunities here for this king to cause a draw. All right, so let's go on to separated split pawns with the center pawn, however, leads to a win. So this was if white ends up with a rook pawn, it's going to end up in a draw. Let's just change it slightly. In the previous example, black's king was here. And so he was able to move in, and then through positioning, he was able then to move over and come and capture this pawn, leaving white with a rook pawn. But in this example, it's going to be the opposite. He has to go next to the pawn he's next to, and then he has to try and stay and get close to, and eventually, now white has a center pawn. And again, the videos on opposition will show you this battle. White wins the opposition and the queening square, and this queen is coming. So when you find yourself here, the defining characteristic is which square is this king on? If he's here, close to the rook pawn, maneuvering is going to leave white with the rook pawn, which leads to a draw. But if black is here, close to the center pawn, then that means white's going to be left with a center pawn, and that's going to lead to a win. So it's very important to see where the king is going to end up at. Well, if we move this up the board to the 5th rank, it's an easy win for white. You can see that he can try and get close to the pawn. Pawn moves, tries to stay in front. And here white has an interesting move. Just check the king. Because if the king captures, he's now outside the square. He can't get into this square. He can try to get close, but the queen is coming. So it's really important to note that these pawns on the 5th rank, compared to being back here on the 4th rank, makes a huge difference because of this check maneuver. All right. So let's take a look at one more thing. What if the pawns are now split by 3? This is an easy win for white. I don't even think we need the king's help here, because when the king approaches one pawn, he gets outside the square, and the other pawn is going to promote easily. Let's just take a quick look. He tries to get close to the pawn. This pawn runs. Certainly you can see that if he captures this pawn and this pawn moves, that the king is really far outside the queening square, or the square of the pawn. So he tries to get back in front, and again we check. And what's he to do? If he captures this pawn, again, he's going to be far outside of the pawn of the square, or the square of the pawn, excuse me. So he tries to stay in the middle, trying to stay close to both pawns, and now it just doesn't matter where he goes. Both pawns are moving, staying in the middle, and what's he to do? No matter which pawn he goes next to, okay, it's done. If he captures this pawn, we have a queen. All right, so let's go over and review just a couple of quick things. 2 pawns should win unless their king can't help. We want to know that the lone king tries to capture one of the pawns while staying close to the other and hoping for a draw, and also hopes for a blundered stalemate. Connected pawns can defend themselves. Pawns 1 file apart often defend themselves until the king arrives. The defender has his best chance if pawns are 2 files apart, but if the pawns are 3 files or more apart, then they don't even need their king's help. So you want to keep an eye on those little details. Watch this video, practice with a friend, and really get a feel for what the king can do against 2 pawns to know whether or not you have a chance for a draw or if it's just a guaranteed loss. Well, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. Please like and share this video. Hope to see you on our Facebook page. Like and follow us there as well for upcoming events, and we'll see you real soon.